All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today is an Analytics Tuesday. We'll be looking at the PFF grades from the Falcons' Week 14 win over the Carolina Panthers, talking about Matt Ryan's performance, as well as what we got from his supporting cast with the blocking up front and those weapons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, writing weekly content over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode, we are going to piggyback off of what we did last week. Instead of having a guest come on and talk about this Week 14 matchup, we're going to do an Analytics Tuesday. We're going to look at the PFF grades from the Falcons' Week 14 win over the Carolina Panthers, talk a little bit about some of the missed opportunities from quarterback Matt Ryan and how that sort of skewed initial perception of his performance, and maybe he was a little bit better than we initially gave credit for. We'll talk about the offensive line grades from three prominent players, including Kaleb McGary, Chris Lindstrom, and talk a little bit about whether Jalen Mayfield has sort of turned a corner as a blocker based off of his grades in Week 14. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Falcons' weapons and whether or not the PFF metrics are saying that the Falcons maybe have a little bit better of a receiver core surrounding Matt Ryan in this offense than a lot of people are willing to give it credit. And then we'll wrap up today's episode giving you an update on Erik Harris, who is now out for the season, the Falcons starting safety with a torn pectoral muscle, and we'll talk about what's next for him, what's next for this defense moving forward on this season. But before we get into all of that on today's Analytics Tuesday episode of Locked On Falcons, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day on a variety of podcast platforms that you check out. Locked On Falcons, of course, that includes Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course now free and available on the YouTube platform. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons now on YouTube, where you can get the podcast a few hours earlier, usually the night before the audio version of the podcast drops. The audio version typically drops at midnight, and the video version of the podcast usually drops sometime between, 8 and 9 o'clock, or sometimes 10 o'clock the night before. So, for you guys out on the West Coast, you get it sometime in the afternoon, but for you East Coast guys, it's a late night thing. I can help put you to sleep each and every night. You can get tucked in by the Locked On Falcons podcast. So now that that's out of the way, let's revisit Matt Ryan's performance. And, we talked about sort of last week him getting pressured on 38% of his dropbacks in that Tampa Bay game. So it didn't look as bad as just looking at the sacks and hits in that game. And this week it was about 39% of his dropbacks that Matt Ryan was pressured by this Panthers team. Matt Ryan had a 47 grade according to PFF while under pressure, which is not great, but pretty typical when you look across the league. This is why pressure matters, because typically quarterbacks, at least based off PFF's grades, are typically being graded in the 40s and 50s on average when they're under pressure. Obviously, you have some players that are being graded much lower than that, and players that are being graded much higher than that. But, in terms of the bell curve, it's usually in that 40 range, and Matt Ryan sort of fits in there. The rest of when we talk about Matt Ryan in this Week 14 game isn't really about his PFF grades. It's just sort of a way of jumping into the conversation. His PFF grade in this game was a 66 overall. Got a little bit of a bump by a 71 run grade thanks to those two quarterback sneaks. But the 66 is the best grade that Matt Ryan has had as a passer or overall since Week 9 against the Saints. And Marks is tied with the Week 2 game against Tampa Bay, where he had a 65.9 or a 66 as the fifth best graded game of his 2021 season. And earlier on Monday, I rewatched the television copy of the game, and obviously I'll watch the film on Tuesday, but I wanted to watch the offense and really focus on the offensive line play as well as Matt Ryan's performance. And I do think I just he deserves a little bit more credit than I initially gave him my rapid reaction on yesterday, where I kind of said it was a middling performance. I still probably would grade it out as probably like a C plus, particularly in comparison to Matt Ryan's overall body of work when we go back, the last 13 plus years. But certainly, I think relative to what we have seen, and that was reflected in his PFF grade, relative to what we have seen in this 2021 season, it was one of his better performances. I would still sort of fit it into the category of, we have 4 good games of Matt Ryan and 9 sort of meh games. It's still in the meh category, but it's at the upper level of the meh. And so one of the things that looking back at the game, it was really basically 2 plays that I think really made the difference in terms of Matt Ryan not necessarily looking as good in sort of 2 throws that he kind of left on the field, 2 potential touchdowns that he potentially left on the field, that if he makes those plays, we're having a much more positive, conversation about how well Matt Ryan played in this Carolina game than we currently are. And the first one was that underthrown deep ball to Tajay Sharp to start the third quarter, where they dialed up a shot play and Matt Ryan basically underthrew Sharp on where he was wide open on that play and potentially could have scored a touchdown on that play had Matt Ryan hit him in stride on that play. And so that was a touchdown that took some points off the board. The Falcons did eventually settle for a field goal on that drive, but that's 7 points instead of 3. And then the other one was in the second quarter when the Falcons were in the red zone and the Panthers dialed up a cover 0 blitz on third down, and Matt Ryan wound up throwing a screen into traffic and it was incomplete. And that was probably a play where he should have thrown to Olamide Zaccheaus, who was wide open over the middle. And that could have been potentially a walk-in touchdown, given the Falcons had run sort of a pick play. I want to say it was Kyle Pitts that sort of ran a rub route, sort of picking the guy covering him, and so Zaccheaus was wide open on a drag route over the middle. And that was a play I think Matt Ryan could have made. We'll see what the film sort of says, but watching the television copy, it looked like where the blitz was coming from with that cover 0 blitz, there was nobody in the middle of the Panthers defense to cover that sort of crossing route from Zaccheaus, and that blitz was coming exactly where Zaccheaus was going to wind up. And Matt Ryan seemingly saw that blitzer because he immediately was looking at, I guess, based off of the television copy, looking at where that blitzer was coming. I want to say it was Jermaine Carter or whatever the case may be. And had he just kind of floated the ball over that guy's head to where Zaccheaus would have been, it would have been a great throw and great anticipation and all that various thing. And Zaccheaus would have had the potential to walk in for a touchdown. So those 2 plays, obviously the Falcons wind up settling for a field goal because of that missed third down conversion. So again, that's another 4 points. So it feels like 8 points potentially were left on the field based off of 2 plays. And, that's the potential between, instead of winning this game 29-21, you're talking about 38-21 or something like that. They probably wouldn't gone for 2 later on after that Hayden Hurst touchdown had they scored touchdowns on those 2 drives that we're talking about. So certainly a solid performance, relatively speaking, for Matt Ryan, and certainly deserves probably a little bit more credit than initially given. And we'll sort of see what the film has to say if I feel like I need to revise anything that I've said on today's episode or need to, correct some statements. Obviously, I'll do that potentially on tomorrow's episode. But without further ado, we'll continue the conversation about the various analytics and focus more on the offensive line, focus a little bit more on the supporting cast surrounding Matt Ryan as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But you guys listen to podcasts for the power of knowledge. You switch to Boost Mobile for the power of saving money, because with Boost, you get the power of a free 5G phone so that you can listen to all the latest episodes of the Locked On Falcons podcast, and the power of 3 unlimited data lines for $30 a month per line so that your family can harness all that brain power too, and the power of one of America's largest 5G networks so you can do it all at the speed of 5G with all that money that you'll be saving and all that knowledge that you'll be gaining. Just how powerful will you become? Switch to Boost Mobile and find out. Get a free Samsung Galaxy A32 5G when you switch to one of America's largest 5G networks. More power to save. Boost Mobile. Free phone limited to new customers and 1 per line. Additional restrictions apply. Offers and coverage not available everywhere for all phones and networks. See boostmobile.com for details. Super Bowl 56 at SoFi is less than 100 days away, and On Location, the official hospitality partner of the NFL, is the only place to score a once-in-a-lifetime Super Bowl ticket and experience package. Select your exact seats and choose from elite experiences featuring an exclusive pregame celebration with NFL legends, 5-star LA hotels, and food by the great Wolfgang Puck. Visit onlocationexp.com/SB56 for more information, or search Super Bowl On Location. That's onlocationexp.com/SB56, or search Super Bowl On Location for more information. So we're talking about the Falcons offensive line grades from this week 14 game, and we're focusing on 3 players. That means we got to revisit Kaleb McGary Island. We're going to visit Jalen Mayfield Island. And we'll talk a little bit about Chris Lindstrom, because Chris Lindstrom had another rough game. But first on Kaleb McGary, he did earn a 91, which is an elite run blocking grade from PFF. He did only have a 32 pass blocking grade. And watching the television copy, whether it deserved an elite grade or whatever the case may be, this was probably Kaleb McGary's best run blocking game of the season. And sort of this was what we were expecting when we drafted Kaleb McGary to be sort of that, road grading sort of right tackle, and he looked that part against Carolina, and hopefully we'll continue to see more of this in the future with Kaleb McGary. As far as the low pass blocking grade, he certainly did give up some pressure. He was credited by PFF with allowing 3 pressures in this game, and some of that did come from Hassan Reddick. But for the most part, I thought he did, relatively speaking, a decent job handling Hassan Reddick for most of this game without a ton of help. There were certainly a number of plays where Reddick was able to get the most of them, and this is part of the thing with PFF's grades, particularly when it comes to pass protection, is it's much more qualitative than quantitative. Like, quantitative is just basically how many pressures you give up, how efficient you are based off of that by their various metrics, and qualitative is like the quality of pressures. And that's part of the reason why Kaleb McGary continue to not get graded highly, even in games where he doesn't give up a ton of pressure. Like, he'll give up, only a handful of pressure, and 3 pressures is not ideal, but certainly not bad for an offensive tackle in the NFL. Like, think of it like if you were an edge rusher and you were, getting 40-ish pressures a season, which would be a little shy of 3 per game, you would be considered Takk McKinley, right? Where a good edge rusher is getting 60, 70 or more pressures a season, which would be like 4 or more, a game. So 3 pressures is not good, but not terrible either. And so because McGary looks bad and he has that 1 or 2 bad reps per game, it really knocks down his grade. And the same, I think, applies to Chris Lindstrom, who had an even lower pass blocking grade than Kaleb McGary's 32, and it was a 13.5 pass blocking grade. And he gave up the same number of pressures, 3, as McGary did. And it was a pretty rough game watching the television copy back on Monday morning, particularly in the early half. I thought he got a little bit better in the second half, but certainly in the first half, it looked like one of the worst games that we've seen Chris Lindstrom play. And based off his PFF grade, it was the second lowest game he's ever had in terms of pass blocking. He graded out pretty well as a run blocker to sort of balance things out. But what was interesting wasn't even like Derek Brown and Daquan Jones that were really giving him struggles. I noticed a number of times where it was other pass rushers for Carolina, like Morgan Fox, that were making him look bad on some of those reps that led to that low grade and in some of those really bad reps. So we'll hopefully see Chris Lindstrom bounce back. And now we've had 2 weeks in a row against Tampa Bay and now Carolina where he has struggled in these games. And basically, if we don't see him bounce back against San Francisco this upcoming week, and presumably I think Eric Armstead is going to be the guy that's going to typically line up on that side of the defense, then we're going to start having to speculate about some things like what's going on with Chris Lindstrom. Is there sort of some secret, unknown, unreported injury that he's dealing with that's led to him basically having 2 of the weaker games that we've seen him have in a very long time? Or if he just bounced back and we're like, okay, he just had a 2-week slump, but maybe his mind was on other things and he was just had a couple of rough games and he's right back to form. So we'll sort of see about that. We'll talk a little bit about Jalen Mayfield, who had his best day, the polar opposite of Chris Lindstrom day, or at least on this particular Sunday, which was his best day to date as a pass protector. He was not credited with giving up 0 pressures. And watching the game again, I certainly think PFF, was correct in that assessment. I didn't see any that they missed there. His run blocking was a little up and down. There was a couple of good blocks that he had on the second level on some key plays, but then he also struggled going up against a guy like Derek Brown as a run blocker, where there were several plays, particularly early in the game, where the Falcons were, as they kept continuing to run left over and over again, there were several plays where Derek Brown was able to push him back into the backfield and blow up those plays and lead to sort of stagnant gains. But he did seemingly do a pretty good job against Derek Brown and Daquan Jones in pass protection. And most of Derek Brown's pressure, he had 3 pressures according to PFF based off of their charting, came when Derek Brown was rushing from the left side of the defense, which is the right side of the offense, which would mean it was going up against someone like Chris Lindstrom. So For those of you that have been dying for me to acknowledge the positives with Jalen Mayfield, there you go. Do I think this game means he's necessarily turned a corner? Nah, I would pump the brakes on that. I want to wait and see. It could be one good game in a sea of bad games, or it could be, the start of what could be, a nice little run at the end of the season that would at least make us feel a little bit better that there was legit progress from Jalen Mayfield over the course of his entire rookie season, and that's something to potentially build off of going into year two. So we really kind of need to see how he performs over these last, 4 or so games. And if we're sitting here saying, oh, over the last 5 games of the season, Jalen Mayfield played well in like 3 or 4 of them, okay, that's a different conversation than if he played well in 1 or 2 of those. That doesn't necessarily move the needle to me as much. So, the last little tidbit as we continue today's analytics portion of the show before we talk a little bit more about the injury front with Erik Harris is I want to talk a little bit about the weapons. And this is something that's applicable given, PFF's metrics. This isn't necessarily applicable to what we saw specifically on Sunday against the Panthers, but just sort of a general trend that I've been paying attention to these last couple of weeks, particularly as I have done research in order to refute the age-old argument about how the Falcons don't have any talent at the receiver position. And you look at Pro Football Focus's yards per route run metric, which is their overall, pass catching efficiency metric, and that's been the metric that for many years, Julio Jones dominated it over his time in the NFL, from 2014 to 2020 or whatever the case may be. And so I would imagine, given that that was a metric that many Falcon fans would use in their endless arguments about why Julio Jones was better than DeAndre Hopkins and Antonio Brown, I'm sure it would carry some weight, although I'm sure some of you guys would now all of a sudden dismiss that metric because of reasons. But when you look at the yards per route run metric for the Falcons' 3 main receivers, which is Russell Gage, Kyle Pitts, and Cordarrelle Patterson, out of the 112 wide receivers currently this year that have 25 or more targets, Russell Gage currently ranks 44th with a yards per route run metric of 1.68. And for the sake of comparison, Jarvis Landry is 1.76, Mike Evans is 1.65, and Adam Thielen is 1.60. If you go back to Mohamed Sanu's best season in Atlanta in terms of yards per route run metric, it was 2017, and his yards per route run that season was 1.57. And you look at the number of targets that Sanu got, at least compared to how often he was being asked to run routes, it's basically identical to what you're seeing from Russell Gage this year, where Gage is getting targeted on about 21.3% of his routes, and Sanu in 2017 was getting targeted on 21% of his routes. And if you look at Russell Gage's yards per route run over the last 4 games specifically, it's 1.82, which would be 24th among wide receivers and right behind someone like a Terry McLaurin at 1.84. And then moving to the tight end position, of the 45 tight ends that have been targeted at least 25 times per game, Kyle Pitts ranks 8th in yards per route run at 1.88. That's ahead of Darren Waller at 1.86 and Travis Kelce at 1.77. And if you're just comparing him to wide receivers that have had a similar workload, DK Metcalf is 1.95 and Amari Cooper is 1.78. Then moving to the running back position, again with the cutoff of 25 targets, Cordarrelle Patterson is 2nd out of 47 running backs with a yards per route run of 2.73, only behind Christian McCaffrey, 2.91. And if you look at running backs prior to this season, since 2016, that have had a yards per route run above 2.50, you only have 3 in the previous 5 seasons. That's Austin Eckler with 2.74 in 2019, Alvin Kamara in his rookie season with 2.84 of 2017, and then Tevin Coleman, former Falcon, in 2016 with 2.54. So the point I'm trying to build here is that basically, in Cordarrelle Patterson, you're getting peak Tevin Coleman, and Russell Gage, you're getting peak Mohamed Sanu, and then in Kyle Pitts, you're getting, at least based off of this metric, a player comparable to what Darren Waller is giving you. And if I gave you those 3 pieces as the foundation of your offense, I don't think many people would be making this argument, as they have made so frequently over the last 4 to 6 weeks, that the Falcons, that Matt Ryan and company have nobody to throw to, and this offense has one of the worst receiver cores in the NFL. That's a pretty solid group of receivers. At least that's a foundation for a functional NFL offense. No one's sitting here saying that Russell Gage, because of this metric, is every bit as good as Amari Cooper or Terry McLaurin or Kyle Pitts at this point in his career is, I would rank him ahead of Darren Waller or Travis Kelce. But I'm just sitting here saying, like, from a production standpoint, you have the foundation for what is a decent offense, right? Not a top 5 unit, but certainly a foundation of a functional passing attack. And again, this is not meant to point fingers or point the blame at Arthur Smith or Matt Ryan or whatever the case may be, but it's going to be interesting to me. And again, if I can put on my prophet hat and open my third eye, 6 months from now, when we're at the height of the offseason hype, with hopefully Cordarrelle Patterson back, hopefully Calvin Ridley back, Kyle Pitts going in the year 2, and potentially the Falcons replacing, if Russell Gage walks in free agency, with whether that's a wide receiver in the draft or free agency, that the expectation is that he's going to put up similar production, at least based off of this yards per route run metric, as what we've gotten from Russell Gage this season. We're going to be sitting here telling ourselves, at least the narrative then, 6 months from now, again, my prophecy powers are telling me this, that we're going to sit here and say, 6 months from now, that this Falcons offense is on the verge of being a top 10 unit. Matt Ryan's going to have this bounce back year. All these factors are going to lead to the Falcons having a much better offensive output. And I'm going to sit here and go sure, but is that really because the Falcons have greatly enhanced the talent level of their roster? Or is it simply because, the talent that they have is potentially going to gel together? We're going to sit here and say, oh, Matt Ryan's going to be a top 10 quarterback. This offense is going to be a top 12 unit or passing attack or whatever the case may be. And, I think there's reasons to be optimistic that the Falcons can potentially achieve those things with Matt Ryan being more comfortable in this offense in year 2, Kyle Pitts being more consistent going into his second year. And if Calvin Ridley can look like the 2020 version of himself once Arthur Smith figures out how to use him in this offense, there are reasons absolutely for the Falcons to be optimistic. My point is just those reasons aren't because the Falcons are going to be much more talented. It's just going to be because the talent that they do have is going to gel, and this coaching staff is going to do a better job of figuring out how to maximize that talent on a weekly or more consistent basis going into 2022. So I just kind of wanted to point that out because, we're talking about PFF metrics, and, it's just one of those things where I just feel like that narrative of talent or lack thereof, I again, continues to be, in my opinion, overblown and overrated. It's not to sit here and say that the Falcons are this top tier talented team. They're probably below average, but they're probably closer to average, and I think a lot of people are willing to give them credit. Is basically the point I'm trying to make. And I think this, PFF metric is not necessarily the end all be all of that, but just part of the conversation where it's like they're getting decent production at 3 of their skill position players, historic production from Kyle Pitts, historic running back production from Cordarrelle Patterson, and Russell Gage certainly over the last month is playing the best football that he's ever played. So this idea that the reason why their offense is struggling because Matt Ryan has nobody to throw to, again, it doesn't carry that much weight. And this is part of the reason why. So that's where we will leave it here on Analytics Tuesday, and we'll wrap up today's Locked On Falcons talking a little bit more about Erik Harris's season-ending injury, what it means for him and his future here in Atlanta, how his performance was, what it means for the rest of this Falcons defense, and all that stuff moving forward, not only this season, but into the offseason. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And of course, I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, in addition to Locked On Falcons, you can find a variety of local Atlanta/Georgia shows on a variety of podcast platforms that Locked On Falcons is available, including Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, and Locked On Bulldogs. And if you're interested in checking out those shows on YouTube, of course, you can find Locked On Braves and Locked On Bulldogs there, as well as Locked On Hawks on Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. So we're in the midst of the holiday season, and maybe you're like me and you constantly struggle to find the perfect gift. Every year, my family does the white elephant gift exchange, and I always struggle to find that perfect gift, but I think my struggles are going to be over now that I've found Stance. Founded in 2009, Stance Apparel represents a radical reinvention of socks, underwear, and active apparel with a sharp focus on comfort, quality, and creativity. Stance brings an atypical aesthetic alongside some of pop culture's hottest collaborators for the ultimate in style and self-expression. Because everything you wear should be a direct extension of who you are and how you feel. Stance has everything from socks, t-shirts, hoodies, shorts, underwear, hats, beanies, and even stylish face masks that make you want to grab them this holiday season. Stance believes that the perfect fit matters more than fitting in. Those that feel good do good. So go see for yourself by going to stance.com, and you can get 15% off your first purchase by using the promo code locked on at checkout. Again, that's promo code locked on at stance.com, so you can enjoy the color and comfort of a life less ordinary this holiday season. So we're talking about Erik Harris being done for the season. It was announced by Ian Rappaport, was the first person I saw have it. And then was later confirmed by the team that Erik Harris is done for the season with a torn pec. We talked about this briefly at the end of yesterday's Rapid Reaction podcast, of that being a possibility, that he suffered early in that game. And obviously, we're now getting a confirmation that that is the case. Obviously, we're going to expect Jalen Hawkins to step into that vacated starting spot. We'll probably also see Sean Williams, who was elevated to the roster yesterday ahead of the game from the practice squad, potentially will have an opportunity to have a permanent role on the roster. And we'll see what those guys, offer now that they're going to have increased reps. We've been talking for several weeks now, going back to that with the London game and Miami game, where Jalen Hawkins played really well and had interceptions in the game. What we would see from this defense if we got to see more of Jalen Hawkins. Unfortunately, injury kind of derailed that moving forward, but now he's going to have that opportunity due to Harris's absence, and we'll see what we get from Sean Harris as well. People forget that Sean Harris did wind up being a functional starter for the Bengals for the better part of 4 years. And so when we talk about Erik Harris, I have a lot of respect for Erik Harris. I certainly was down on Erik Harris and the potential for him starting when it became increasingly clear over the summer that Erik Harris was going to win the starting safety spot instead of Richie Grant. I was like, oh no, this is a horrible sign that this defense is going to be terrible if Erik Harris is garnering significant snaps, because Erik Harris has only really started on bad defenses. And we saw that the two previous years with the Raiders in the case. And to be fair, the Falcons don't have a great defense. So the fact that Erik Harris was starting for them continue to prove that to be the case. But a testament goes to Erik Harris, because he certainly blew away my expectations. Not to say here and say he played amazing football, but to me, he kind of really embodied the do your job mantra that Dean Pease is trying to instill in this defense, because I saw a player that, compared to a lot of other players that the Falcons have in the back seven, whether we're talking about the two main linebackers and Foye Oluokun and Deion Jones, or the other defensive backs, with the exception of maybe AJ Terrell, I rarely saw Erik Harris out of position, like basically freelancing and doing his own thing and making these sort of mental errors. Whether he was the guy that you really wanted matching up in the slot against certain receivers, which he was asked to do for a couple of weeks there after Isaiah Oliver's injury, whether it was being asked to cover tight ends like Gronk and others. And while guys like Gronk and Hunter Henry got the better of him, it wasn't like he was completely out of position. He was out there contesting several of those throws. The only real knock on Erik Harris that I had this season was, inconsistent tackling. And we saw that on display in that Dallas game and in that New England game, where he got, trucked a couple of times by those running backs in those games. And so that was probably the only knock. But I think overall, in terms of basically being that guy, that do everything guy that was being asked to wear multiple hats in this defense, I thought Erik Harris stepped up in a major way. And I certainly think is in a position that when he becomes a free agent after the season, coming off of this injury, should be offered a contract to come back. Now, not expecting him, nor do I'm sitting here advocating that Erik Harris should be expected to start next year for this team, but as a sort of reserve player that can be a capable, competent reserve player that you can trust, that can come off the bench and do his job, I think Erik Harris certainly has earned that opportunity. And we'll just sort of have to see in terms of the potential upgrades that the Falcons could have at that safety position this upcoming offseason, whether they need to make that move, because we're seeing more of Jalen Hawkins, you're seeing Sean Williams, or even Richie Grant getting more opportunities there, and whether or not the Falcons have some in-house options to sort of step into that potential starting spot, or will the Falcons have to feel compelled to have to upgrade that either in free agency or the draft this offseason? So again, safety is one of those positions that we talk about the Falcons needing to upgrade, but I would not put safety on that list of positions where the Falcons are quote unquote untalented at as some people would argue. I think Erik Harris is one of the reasons why, because I think he, again, while his ceiling may not be as high as what you would ideally want in the scheme. I certainly think he was a player that, relatively speaking, was outperforming a lot of expectations. And as I said, certainly my expectations, given how low they were going into the season. So we'll just sort of have to see what the rest of the season brings as far as the safety positions and how that informs what the Falcons will potentially do this offseason. So unfortunately for Erik Harris, his 2021 season is over, but hopefully, as I've explained already on today's episode, hopefully it's not the end of his time in Atlanta, because I certainly think he can add some value to this defense and potentially on special teams next year if he's not starting on defense. So we'll see what happens with that. But there you guys have it on another Analytics Tuesday. Of course, tomorrow we will be answering your listener questions as well as breaking down the film. There's not anything specifically that I'm going to be focused on when I watch the film. If something jumps out to me, we'll talk about it. But this is also an opportunity for you guys to get some of your questions answered. I know I still probably have a couple of questions I didn't answer for last week that I might try to get to some of those on tomorrow's episode. But, the first come, first serve type of mentality. So if you get your questions in sooner versus later, you have an opportunity to get those questions answered on tomorrow's, all 22 review and Q&A episode. And of course, if you want to send in your questions, of course, you can do so on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or of course, you can post a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube page. And before we duck out of here, guys, I want to let you guys know about the Locked On Bets podcast. Of course, if you're out here trying to make a little bit of extra cash in this holiday season that you can then spend or at least hoard until next year, Locked On Bets is your best avenue here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is joined every day by host your boy Q, and Lee's giving you his daily picks, his blowout specials, and of course his lock of the day that's going to make you a little bit extra cash. As I've said several times now on the podcast over the last several weeks, Lee has been killing it this year. So if you've been following his advice, you've been making quite a bit of moolah. So for the rest of you that aren't subscribed to Locked On Bets, make sure you subscribe so that you can get in on that action. And of course, Locked On Bets is free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. So guys, there you have it here for another Analytics Tuesday on Locked On Falcons. We'll be back tomorrow with a all 22 review and Q&A/mailbag. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. Till then.